Hello and welcome once again to Conscious TV. My name is Iain McNay and my guest today is Shawn Nevins. Hi Shawn.
Hi Ian.
And Shawn was recommended by Tes Hughes, who we had as a guest about 3 or 4 years ago, who Renata interviewed, who we really liked. He's over from America and he wrote a book called Subtraction, the Simple Math of Enlightenment, which is great because it's a lot his story and then all the wisdom that came out of the story, and has a happy ending. I always like books with happy endings. And Shawn is a multifaceted, talented person insofar as he's also made 2 films, Closer Than Close, a portrait of seeking and finding our true self, with interviewing some teachers, some of whom we've interviewed on Conscious TV over the years, and also Meetings with Remarkable Women, which is really remarkable women who've had significant openings and have found a level of who they really are. He has many hobbies. He's interested in caving, and he's written an ebook which I looked at online called Adventures in Caving, Kentucky and Indiana. He's written poetry in a book with Bob Ferguson doing the images, called The Images of Essence. And he's also written a book which I meant to bring with me but I couldn't find, called The Celibate Seeker. So we're going to explore Shawn's life, and actually afterwards we're going to do a separate program which is about some hints he's got, first aid in preparing for a spiritual life. So Shawn, when you were younger than you are today, you weren't a very happy chap, because your book starts with when you were living in Kentucky, university there, 18 years old, and you were pretty miserable, weren't you?
I was. That was my first time being away from home, going off to school, and I was a very shy person, so being thrown into a new environment and making new friends was very difficult for me. Also, just the usual problems of what am I going to do with my life? Being a freshman in college, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do.
And so how did things evolve in terms of, you went to some meetings, I think, and you started to explore reading different books? How did things move on from there?
Yeah, that's really those 4 years of being an undergrad in the university. I had a lot of angst my freshman year, and then the next year in school, I sort of I threw myself into academics basically, and decided that, all right, this is what I want to do. This is the life that I want to build for myself. I want to become a university professor and do research someday and have a little house out in the country and be married. I had this image in my mind of what I had settled on, and I just threw myself wholeheartedly into that. And that sort of, my social awkwardness and these larger questions about, well, what really is the purpose of life, those things faded away. And I just focused on that goal. So it wasn't until I left the University of Kentucky, went to North Carolina State University, went to graduate school, the next step to becoming a professor, that again, those questions arose, because I found that, being a graduate student doing research isn't quite what I thought that it would be. It was an eye-opening experience for me, and I began once again to question, like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? And I met a girl, which, I don't know about you, but that's like a recipe for disaster, meaning someone who I threw all of my hopes onto this person of, she is going to be one of the reasons for my life, and that very quickly didn't work out. And so school didn't work out, the relationship didn't work out, and really put me in a space that I didn't know what to do. Mm. And I was literally walking the campus one afternoon, just depressed and uncertain about my future, and I saw a poster that said, "What is Enlightenment?" And it was a talk by Richard Rose. I had no idea who this guy was or what Enlightenment was, but I thought, maybe there's something to this. I ought to go check this out. And that led me to hearing him, and just like listening to him talk. I had no idea what he was talking about, but I literally felt like he was talking to me during the talk that he gave. Like he was trying to tell me something, and it was important. And I signed my name on a mailing list for that group and started going to meetings and learning more about philosophy and Richard Rose.
Because Richard Rose, I'd heard of, and I'd seen a couple of his books. Of course, he died a few years ago, but he was quite a significant teacher on a certain level, wasn't he, in America on the spiritual scene, so to speak.
Yeah, he really he sort of rose up in the early 70s in Pennsylvania, Ohio, New Jersey, Virginia, sort of the eastern seaboard, eastern part of the country. Eventually they had a group out in LA. So he was pre-internet, obviously. He was relatively known in the 70s, and then kind of faded away in the 80s, and there was a bit of a resurgence in the early 90s thanks to August Turak, who was one of his students. And he started a little group called the Self-Knowledge Symposium in North Carolina. And I remember Richard Rose said one time, he said, so all you people coming up from Raleigh, you're the last wave, and it's a rather small wave at that. So there were a dozen or 15 people was that last wave of students of his. And
I think you called him Aug, didn't you? Is it August?
Yeah, some people called him Aug or Augie.
And he was kind of, you were going to his groups, and he was giving you recommended books to read, and it was feeding something in you.
Definitely. Augie was and is he's a very dynamic individual. He was very successful in business, and he took a lot of his experiences in the corporate world and would sort of weave stories of what a person could be if they really threw themselves into whatever endeavor they chose to throw themselves in. And it was just, I didn't know about character development or self-improvement or any of these things, and Augie really introduced me to, if you apply energy to changing yourself, developing yourself, improving yourself, focusing yourself, you can achieve a lot.
Yes.
And he just happened to point that achievement energy toward enlightenment and towards Richard Rose.
Yes, and somehow it's also, I think these things are sometimes separated when they shouldn't be. Personal development is really important to find your potential, because helping to find your potential is, as you found out, helping to focus. If you're interested in the spiritual path, then you start to really utilize what you find on the spiritual path, rather than just floating from one thing to another and not really having a drive to take it where it could go.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Rose, even though Rose was the enlightened teacher, he used to talk about the first steps for a person would be just having the discipline to literally walk around the block. If you can't do anything else, just get yourself out of the door and decide that I am going to walk around the block every day at a particular time. And that's the beginning of making yourself into someone who can decide to take an action and then follow through with it.
Yeah. I know one of the books on the reading list was by Spensky, The Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution. And that, I know, had an effect on you. And when I just read what you wrote about it, it had an effect on me as well. And it has a diagram in your book, which I got Renata to actually draw bigger so we can show it on camera. That's the diagram, which wouldn't necessarily mean a lot until Shawn explains what is behind that diagram.
Yeah, when I first saw that diagram and read that in that little paragraph by Ouspensky, he was talking about the multiplicity of eyes within the self and how we aren't actually a unified being. And it was the first time that I had ever come across that idea, and it was instantly recognizable. That any time that I had a debate within myself, Ouspensky was framing that debate as a one eye and then another eye that has its own desires and fears and wants. And in the diagram, it shows 30 or 40 eyes that are within us.
So you've got one thought or feeling there, another thought or feeling there, and nothing central is holding them together. That for me was the fascinating bit, because I know as well for myself all these bits going on, but of course we feel there's something at the centre of it, but what Ouspensky was saying was there's nothing at the centre of it. And that's the rather startling thing. We're just held together by all these different bits, these different sides of our character, personality, ego.
Yeah. At the time, I understood one level of what he was saying, but not ultimately what he was pointing to.
Yeah, he says, just a quote from him from your book, each of these eyes represents at any given moment a very small part of our brain, mind, or intelligence. Man must know what he has and what he has not. And that was the start of unfolding, wasn't it, for you, to find out what you have not. So what is not, in effect, what you thought was you.
Yeah, I mean, the whole title of the book, Subtraction.
Yes.
You know, in retrospect, I could see how my way, if you will, was a subtractive way.
Yeah, it was about letting go or allowing things to fall away and seeing what was left underneath.
Yeah, which comes from Richard Rose's idea of backing away from untruth, that we shouldn't speculate that, I read that enlightenment is like this. Once I'm enlightened, I'll be this way. I'll be peaceful, or I'll be happy, or I'll feel at one with the world. That's just all speculation.
Yes.
And the only way to actually work one's way towards something unimaginable and inconceivable is to back away from what is obviously not true.
And what were the kinds of things you found out to start with that were obviously not true? Just give some examples.
Well, it began at a very simple level of, for example, I'll describe to you what I looked like back in those days. I wore a trench coat and boots and had long hair down to my shoulders, and I wore lots of jewelry, and I had this image that I had created for myself that I'm going to present to the world. You know, I'm this kind of person, and I want you to think of me as, you know, kind of a tough guy, but he's cool, and, you know, this complete fantasy. I actually had no idea whatsoever what I looked like to other people. I probably looked completely ridiculous, but I thought that I was walking around presenting a story or a picture to the world.
Yes.
And I began to see that, you know, that is, at a very basic level, that's not me. I've created that and decided to present it to the world. So I got my hair cut and shaved and just wore regular clothes, and I shed a lot of posturing that I was presenting to the world, and a lot of energy that was going into that posturing was freed up. You know, I lifted weights, so I was, you know, lifting weight to try to build big muscles so that I would look impressive, and all the girls would fall in love with me. And just I mentioned in the book, if you've ever seen a bodybuilder posing, and they flex all their muscles, and the strain of holding that pose is incredibly difficult. And I felt like I had released a pose that I had been holding. And that was the beginning for me of backing away from my truth.
And then you visited Richard Rose on the farmhouse where he lived, quite a few hours drive from where you lived. And you ended up staying there, didn't you? And having all kinds of adventures, which didn't always turn out the best.
Yes, that's for certain.
Because about half your book is one disaster after another, really.
Yes. It was not, if you were to imagine what a spiritual search would look like, that's not what you would imagine that a spiritual search would be. Yeah.
So just let's run through examples. So I think one of the first things you did was you had was it a fast for a week? You didn't eat for a week?
We did. I wound up leaving graduate school 2 years in because a group of people from the Self-Knowledge Symposium were going to spend the summer on Rose's farm, and I thought, wow, all my friends are going to go up there and I'm going to miss out, but I have to stay here and do research for my thesis, and I had this tremendous debate: do I stay or do I go? And my father actually passed away that spring, and when he passed away, it really put into perspective a lot of the hedging that I had been doing, of playing it safe, that I'll get my degree and then I'll look into the spiritual stuff, see what this enlightenment is all about, but I'll have my degree in my back pocket in case things don't work out. So when he passed away, I came back from the funeral and quit, and spent the summer at the farm and did the week-long fast, which I thought that the week-long fast was going to be how we separated who were the serious spiritual students from those who were just playing at this, and that at the end, whoever was left, Rose would hand enlightenment to them, and that would be it. But the fast was a week of misery and and despair, and literally laying on a couch in a little cabin, without enough energy to read a book or meditate or anything, just waiting for the last day of the fast.
And so the day after the fast, you'd had your meal. Did you feel you got anything from it at all?
Well, that's a great question, because, and I think this is kind of a theme, that all these disasters, although at the time they seemed like disasters, but really each thing that happened, there was something of value that came from it. There really was. And the fast, that was actually the first time I was so tired and so exhausted that it was the first time that I saw a thought appear completely on its own, seemingly separate from myself. Because I had the distinct thought that if I keep doing this fast, I'm going to die. And then the thought appeared that you're going to keep doing it. It wasn't a decision that I made, it just appeared. And that was profound to see that. That really changed my perspective on thought. It was like a clue.
And so you were the viewer watching, or you were the person, the watcher watching the thought, the observer watching the thought arise, take form, and then disappear.
Yeah. Now that didn't, even though I saw that didn't instantly change my relationship to thought. It was like a glimpse of what goes on. I mean, after the fast was over, I still went back to making decisions in a very laborious way, thinking over them, but I had the memory of, I saw something about thought, and that's puzzling, and that's interesting, and there's probably something worth exploring there.
And I know you had work periods, you were working on the farm, doing a lot of physical work, which is probably quite good for you because it kept you quite grounded. And then at some point, was it at this point you decided to really commit to staying the long term there? Because you were due to go back at one point, weren't you, I think, to Raleigh where you were living, and you made the commitment to stay at the farm. Other people left, but you said, no, I'm staying here.
Yeah, commitment is a funny thing. That summer, when that summer was over, I went back to Raleigh and got a job since I was done with school. And 9 months or so later, I realized that I wanted to be around Richard Rose as much as possible because he had this thing, Enlightenment, and that's what I wanted to go after.
And how did you know that he had this thing, Enlightenment?
Yeah, my very first time I saw him, I thought there's something about this guy that's unique, but Rose had an ability, or there was a phenomenon around him that people refer to as rapport, which I think that we all have experienced to some degree with one another. We use the word rapport. Like you and I can have a rapport. We feel like we know what the other person is thinking almost, or where this conversation is going, or there's a simpatico between us. And we had but Rose would have rapport sittings where people would gather and sit quietly, and a mood, if you will, would descend in the room, and an electricity sometimes would arise, and it would affect people differently. Some people would literally sit there and go, why is everyone so quiet? It just didn't have any effect on them. And other people would feel like the heavens were about to open.
So how did the electricity affect you?
The effect on me in that experience was that I remember the words were, he knows. Those words just formed in my mind, like, he knows. Have you ever had that feeling that, like, when you know something is true, like your whole body, it's almost a vibration or electricity, like your whole body lights up. Like there's something important here.
Yes.
And that's what happened when it got quiet, and whatever that energy was, I knew that he knew, and that's what I wanted. I didn't know what it was, but it was something real.
Yeah, it's kind of the feeling I get to you from listening to you is that before you were you wanted to work away from something, which was your misery, your unhappiness, and this was almost like the positive, that you were going towards something because you felt it energetically. You knew. You felt he knew, and then you knew. You didn't know exactly what you knew, but you knew that's where you were going.
Yes. And he said that at times, that if there was something that he could do for people, it would be to give them a taste of enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. Give them a taste of that, and that taste would essentially be like a hint that something that they would know that there's something out there, and I want to find it for myself.
That's what we all have to do, isn't it? Find it for ourselves. It's so important. Anyway, I'm not going to run through all your adventures, but
yeah, it would be a while.
We'd be here all day. But you did, I think, one thing that made me smile, because I've done lots of things too which haven't always brought what I hoped they would bring. You decided to do a 30-day solitary retreat again on the farm, and I think it was winter, it wasn't great living conditions, and again it kind of appeared to be an utter disaster. I think by the second or third day you were already regretting it. Yes. But you made the commitment to do it, and that's one of the things that drew me to your book, was I admired your, once you said you were going to do something, you were committed, and I know that from myself. I think it's so important that you commit to finish something through that you feel is important. So you committed to the 30 days. It was very difficult, but again, you got something out of it afterwards, I think, didn't you?
I did. There were, there were sublime moments in that experience of just feeling at one with my surroundings and a complete peace. certainly those moments happened. And it was really an opportunity. I think the focus, I mean, you don't know, when you're on a solitary retreat and you're literally not going to talk to anyone or see anyone for 30 days, like it is, you face a lot of things that you're afraid of. There's not a lot left except you and whatever you're up to. And it's an amazing opportunity to really focus and really drill down into something. And Rose would say, you shouldn't take a lot of books out there with you. Maybe just take one book, because you don't want to distract yourself with books. And yeah, I mean, I never did one again. I'll say that. I never did a 30-day again. But I was very glad I did it. But I would do week-longs and 2-day and 3-day retreats after that.
So it was always this way of subtraction that you call the book Subtraction. It was about knowing what you weren't. You weren't sure what you were, but you were finding out what you weren't.
Yeah, really. When you get down to it, Rose talked about the view is not the viewer. If we want to really plunge into what is the method here, or what is this about? We say subtraction, we say backing away from untruth. We talked about that level of the image that you present. But then once you've worked out some of that and you've kind of smoothed out the personality enough that you're not bumbling your way through life, well then you begin to look at things like the thoughts that come through your mind and the feelings that come up. And well, where are the untruths in those things? And of course we have a level of untruth of simply lying to ourselves and rationalizing. And that's where friends come in, because they can help us. They can help detect when we're telling ourselves little stories about why we took particular actions.
Yes.
And that's a level of backing away from untruth, clarifying our thinking process.
Yes. You say at one point in the book you had, I think it was on a retreat, you had insights such as, I can't locate the source of my thoughts because I am thought. Could it be that my sense of identity is built on sand? Because you were raising deep questions about what is the source of your identity. And it's difficult to find an answer, isn't it? The ultimate source of identity.
Yeah, but I think that those questions, or that attitude of questioning, or that attitude of saying, I don't know, is very valuable, because it leaves a possibility open for you.
Yeah. Richard Rose, I know, also was very, I know from your book, he was very focused on you finding intuition, and you felt you didn't have intuition. So you had to work extra hard at that.
Yeah, I mean, I still, my default, or my native state, perhaps you would say, is geared towards the logical side. And let me think this through. And let me work this out on paper. Let me see if this makes sense. And Rose didn't operate that way. He was very much a person who operated by a sense of what to do next, or feeling. But he would always say, use reason to have a check on that. He didn't say just throw reason out the door. He said you have reason and you have intuition, and use the two together. And I felt like my intuitive side needed work, needed exercise, if you will.
Yes, yeah. So how long did you actually stay at his farm altogether? It was a few years, I think, wasn't it?
It was probably 3.5 years, maybe almost 4 years. It was too long, I always say.
Yeah, because he also encouraged you to be celibate, didn't he?
Mm-hmm.
And you did have quite a close relationship with a woman there called Belle, but it never became a sexual relationship. It was close, but it wasn't sexual.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you feel you got from the celibacy?
I would say the primary thing that I got from celibacy was, oftentimes I would think of thought patterns or thought realms that we have. security was a big thought pattern of mine. Like I would be worried about financial security or job security or those sorts of things. So that's like a mass of thoughts in the mind. You could call it an eye. It's like one of those mini eyes. So that sexual energy or that sexual interest is another one of those eyes. And I felt like by being celibate, it put a door, perhaps is the word to use, in front of that realm of thought. That just wasn't, there wasn't any point in thinking about that because I wasn't going to act on it. So I didn't go walking down the street looking at every girl that walked past and thinking, oh, is she interested in me? Oh, did she just look at me? You know, which is the perhaps normal way that the male or myself, I'll talk about myself, I might walk down the street. Every other woman, like, are they thinking about me? Are they interested in me? Are they attractive? All that was just gone because I'd made a commitment that I'm going to be celibate. So those thoughts just sort of died off. They just weren't there.
Yeah, it just underlines again for me. I know I just said this earlier, but this kind of the importance of commitment on the well, anything in life, but especially on the spiritual search, because it's not an easy path for so many people, and yet it's the people that really stay on the path and commit. Something normally happens sooner or later, and we'll come on a little bit later to what happened to you. It's like you've got to keep going and keep going and keep going.
Yeah, there's that quote from Rose about if I tell you to walk 5 miles, don't walk 1 mile and turn around and come back. And he was pointing to that in a humorous way of, you know, I'm telling all of you something. I'm giving you all some guidelines here, and go for it.
Yes.
Keep at it.
But you did leave the farm, and I think you felt he was the beginning of his, I think he had dementia in the end, or Alzheimer's, so you felt he was losing a little bit his memory and his
a lot.
Yeah. And how was that for you when you realized that he was mentally losing it?
Oh, it was extremely challenging because I in the back of my mind, I still would think, well, maybe Mr. Rose will somehow, people used to talk about him zapping people. He never did this, but there was just this idea that perhaps he could transmit his enlightenment experience to you somehow on a silver platter, and boom, you would be enlightened if you were worthy enough. He didn't talk about that, but there was that in the sort of floating around in the side conversations around him. And so certainly seeing him, he had Alzheimer's, so seeing him begin to lose his memory, you know, it eliminated that. Look, that's not going to happen. He's not going to transmit an experience to you. But not only that, now he's no longer going to be that source of that feeling that this is real. Like being around the man, standing next to the man at times for me would be, I could almost feel like there's depth, there's profundity there, and it would resonate with me and remind me of how tangible, how close an answer really was. And now that's gone. So somehow I have to find this on my own. Not only that, but what does it mean when the enlightened guy forgets his enlightenment experience? Think about how confrontational that is. I mean, he literally the way that he talked about his experience changed as his mind, whatever he was going through, as his mind decayed, if you will, how he remembered that or talked about it changed. It's very confrontational. Is there, you know, if you can't hold on to enlightenment, well, what's the value of it? Those sorts of thoughts came up.
Yeah. So you eventually left the farm and you went to see different teachers, all of which I'm aware of and a couple of I've seen personally. The first one you saw was, not the first one, but the first one I was aware of was Bernadette Roberts. And she had 2 books out a few years ago, Experience of No Self and I think The Path of No Self, which I read at the time, and just briefly talk about how it was to spend a little time with Bernadette Roberts.
Probably the most valuable thing for me about Bernadette was that I felt the same thing around her that I felt around Rose. Like, this woman there's depth to her. She has something, she emanates something profound. And so it wasn't just this one person. I mean, it's a little hard to imagine these days, but in those days, long ago, in the mid-1990s, early 90s, like, you got information about teachers through word of mouth or through finding a book in a bookstore. You didn't go online and type spiritual teacher and decide, oh, I'm going to go see this person and that person. Here's their schedule and where they're going to be. It was a lot harder to find people. So I literally just found a book by Bernadette Roberts in a used bookstore. And then I thought, as I was casting about for what am I going to do, I remembered that and looked at that book, and I thought I'd like to go see this woman.
Yeah. She was very much from the Christian tradition, wasn't she? So the terminology was a little bit different from Richard Rose.
I to this day, I don't really understand Bernadette's books or her way of going about the spiritual search. She didn't help me in terms of giving me tools or techniques.
Yes.
But she inspired me to get through a very tough period of, Rose is gone, and is this enlightenment real? It's like, oh yeah, this is real. There are other people out there. And she also just gave me a little bit of practical, personal advice of,
you told me not to do what you were doing, but to do something else.
Yes. Which other people had been telling me, and I had told myself, but hearing it from a complete stranger kind of was a good slap across the face for me.
And then you went to Germany to see Mother Mira.
I did, yeah.
Again, that's somebody Renata and I have been to see. And how was it with Mother Mira?
Mother Mira was an interesting experience, but I experienced absolutely nothing being around Mother Mira, and going forward, and I think you kneeled before her or something like that.
You kneeled, and then she would put her...
That's it, right.
A hand on your forehead, yeah.
Right, I just, it was absolutely a flat experience for me. And I remember I got rather cantankerous at the end, and the last time I went up to her for Darshan, I thought, I'm just going to be really angry inside when I go up there and see what that does. And it was the same, just kind of complete flat experience. So.
Yeah. And then you went to England a little bit later to see Douglas Harding, who works the headless way. And I think you got a little bit more out of that, didn't you?
I did, and we're a lot of things happened between leaving the farm and going to see Douglas Harding.
Yes.
There was actually a valuable time for me before seeing Harding.
Okay.
Because I really struck out on my own, like finding my own way. I moved off the farm. I got a job working with children, which was just an extremely valuable experience for me to work around children and be around that energy. Again, working on intuition, and that's when I started writing poetry. It was before actually seeing Douglas Harding. And a real key for me was that Rose had said, just in casual conversation one time, he said, learn to sit in rapport with yourself. And I wrote that in a notebook. I had no idea what it meant, and I just put it away. And then at some point I remembered that statement, and I thought, there's a key for finding my own inner guru, my inner guidance. And I started to go out into the woods with a notebook and just sit and wait. And feeling started to come to me, or words started to come to me, and it was a new way it was really a new way of meditating. From before, I was very intense, focused, Vipassana style meditation, watching thought, and when does the next thought come up, and where does it come from, and really trying to work my way to the root of thought. And I finally gave up on that, in this different way, a softer way, if you will, perhaps, is how I started to look once again for who am I.
And that was, that's good you said, who am I, because in a way that's what you've been doing in the last few years on this journey, is finding out at the deepest level you could, who am I?
The question would change. At times where does thought come from was a big question for me, because I could literally see it just appearing out of nowhere. Where does feeling come from? Those were questions that puzzled me and got me to look deeper and deeper at a more granular level, what's really going on in the mind. And then, who am I? Really?
And you took the time to follow these questions, which is so important in our busy world, to take the time. You had the courage to give yourself time, because you had a job as a salesman for a time, and you also say that in the book, that when you were working in the world, as you hinted, your psychological health improved, because you found a degree of ground, and you were earning a living and mixing with so-called normal people, so you had a perspective on things, which I guess being on the farm and being in that isolated environment you lost to some extent.
Yeah, the farm was, many people have said, well, you have to bring this back into the world at some point.
Yeah.
You can have all sorts of states when you're in isolation from most of the world. You can feel at great peace, but then if you walk onto a street corner, how do you feel? That's the real test of what you've discovered. So I was fortunate to have time away from the world, and then time in the world, but really of my choosing, and that I chose to get a job working with children because I felt like that would help with my intuition, and it was very valuable. And then I eventually got a job in sales because, again, I just curious about what can this mechanism do and how will it react.
And you were good at selling, weren't you?
Well,
it says so in the book.
I did. I was the best salesperson in my first month. I was the top of the heap my first month.
If you put your mind to it.
But it was challenging.
Yeah.
It was challenging for me because to this day, I'm really, at heart, I'm an introvert.
Yeah.
And to put yourself out there and push people a little bit, see what their objections are, that's not my natural way of being in the world.
And then you found a book that changed everything. And it was a book I read many, many years ago, which I found quite a hard read. Do you want to talk about the book, what it was and how it changed things?
Are you talking about Merrill-Wolff?
I'm talking about Franklin Merrell-Wolff,
Okay.
Experiments and Philosophy, I think the book is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually, the book was interesting to me and intriguing to me, but it was actually there's a talk that he gave that was really the piece that drove home for me, and that was a talk called The Induction, and that was Merrill-Wolff that I could relate to. Experience philosophy is a very difficult read.
I know.
As I mentioned, and I joked about how just reading the back cover of the book, I need a dictionary in order to understand what the back cover is, much less all the 400 and something pages in between. So I don't know if you want me to go into the induction and that paper that I read.
Well, I'm interested really, as I say, I read the book about 20 years ago and I found it hard work, and it didn't do anything for me. And then, but you sent away for a course, is that right? Or a set of tapes?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a point when you were listening to the tapes where you got something so significant. So I'm interested in hearing about that.
Yeah. This was actually the point in time that I'd been to see Douglas Harding. You mentioned Douglas.
Yes.
And he really re-inspired me.
Okay.
And that's what so many of these teachers did, in a way, is not so much specific things that they might have said, but many times just an inspiration to keep on, keep looking. And Douglas was very much that way for me. Of course, he has those amazing experiments.
We did a program on that many years ago, yes.
Yeah, and those were very confrontational in a way to me. He's really challenging me with these experiments and what's really going on. And that was useful, but Douglas himself, again, was just that depth. He was a person who carried that depth with him. And being around him, once again, I knew that there's something out there. Can I find it? I don't know. But it's out there. So I went to see him, and then I had moved to Texas at the time. And this was when I started creating the spiritualteachers.org website.
This is the website which I've seen, yes.
Yeah. So the internet's here now. It's actually the internet boom was going on. This is 1998, 99. Everybody's putting up websites, and I thought, well, I'm going to put up a website and share some of the teachers that I've seen and things of value that I've come across. And as part of that, I looked back at Franklin Merrell-Wolff, and I knew that Merrill-Wolff was, again, a significant figure and a profound person, even though I hadn't met him. I thought, I'd like to know a little bit more about him. Oh, there's these talks that you can get. And I sent away for transcripts of several of his talks. And one talk in particular was called The Induction. And, I still remember, I write this in great detail in the book. If people don't read anything else in the book, I would say, read that one little section. Because Merrill-Wolff in that talk, he walked a person through backing away from untruth at all of these levels that we've just talked about. And it was as if he were there with me, talking to me as I was reading that paper. And I can't really get across the feeling of it, but it was as if like he was a friend sitting next to me and saying, well, so Shawn, let's begin. And he says something like, let's begin a little analysis. Just like that, very conversational.
Yeah.
Let's look at the body. And it may come to you that you are not the body. And he begins like walking through the body and feeling and thoughts. And as he walked through each of these levels of who we believe ourselves to be, I was nodding my head. Like, yes, I've seen this. I know this.
He took the stages. You are not the body.
Mm-hmm.
You are not the feelings.
Mm-hmm.
You are not the thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
So what are you?
Right. And he walked you through. And after the thoughts, he said, well, what you are basically is the sense of being. That's, there's nothing closer to you than that sense that I exist. I don't remember his words exactly, but I'm trying to give you a feel for it. And yes, at my heart of hearts, right, I feel that I exist. But yet, he says, yet, you can see that, you can observe that feeling, and therefore, it's not you. And so what are you left with? Your deepest feeling, your sense of I am, your sense of existing. You can see that. And he says, this is he calls it the slippery ego or something like that. He says it can slip around and confuse you like the dickens, because maybe you've had that experience in meditation of seeing awareness. and suddenly you're aware of awareness, or you're conscious of awareness, or you're aware of consciousness, however you want to phrase it, or you see observation going on, and it seems like there's another observer observing what's going on.
That's right.
And he says you can get caught in this,
Yes.
spinning round and round.
The observer watching the observer.
The observer watching the observer.
Yeah.
And I'm nodding my head, like, yes, I know exactly what you mean. I can't get out of it.
Yes.
I'm just stuck. And then he said, and mayhap at that moment, it may dawn upon you that you are that which is never an object before consciousness, and mayhap at that moment the heavens will open. And they did, and it was literally as if, I don't know how to explain it at that point, but that the room just filled with this intense energy and something which you can't describe in words was revealed. But it wasn't revealed to me in that sense, because there wasn't Shawn there. And as I say that, instantly the mind begins to conceptualize, oh, it must have been like this, or it must have been like that. And that's why, Merrill-Wolff just left you at that precipice, and maybe something will happen at this point.
I'm going to read a little bit about the book, how you did describe the process. I think it's so key. So you wrote, it finally dawns. I am that which is never an object before consciousness. You just said that. I am that which is never an object before consciousness. I, Shawn, was ever an object. You, Shawn, was ever an object and was always a thing to die. Shawn always had to die. In face of a stark revelation, I felt myself fading away, but there was no fight. The runner himself was vanishing. Runner being Shawn was vanishing. The nothingness that I was fading into and had so feared was already inside me. Outside and inside were fundamentally the same. No observer, no observed, just one. I felt I was dying, but I was not afraid. Feeling was of slipping into darkness, losing everything I had held on to. A blackness that was motionless yet vibrant. I read that a few times when I read that, because it's almost as if you want to read the end of the book to get the ending. That was the ending That's how it was. Shawn disappeared, but he never existed in the first place. And that's why I like this so much, because that was the clue from Ouspensky right at the beginning. Just a lot of eyes, nothing to hold it together. And you could then understand what Douglas Harding had been saying in more depth.
Yeah. And that's what I often say to these days. Like, I like doing the experiments with people, but the implication of what the experiments are really pointing to, what we are at center, well, that is, you don't want to see, or many people don't want to see that, or aren't ready to see that.
Yes. Yeah. We're going to have to finish in about 2 or 3 minutes, but we're going to do a part 2, which is going to have a practical side of your book. And I think I'd also like to a little bit continue where we are from here in part 2 as well, because you do talk about how you cannot live from the absolute in the world. There has to be a practicality and a degree of personality. I think that's very interesting to talk about. So I'm going to finish this part. I'm going to ask you to read something you wrote, because you'll read it better than me. And it was a poem. You might remember it actually, but if you don't remember
it,
that's what you wrote, poem-wise, after you'd had that experience.
Oh, yeah.
Which I thought was very beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's poetry-like. So it says, God is here. He rings in the death of all we know. Rejoice, the end begins. A new life, nothing ever the same. We are everlasting. Rejoice, I am free. Behind these words flow everlasting light. It is back there. Doors open, look inside. This is my way, no plan. You cannot follow but must try. God is here. God is here. Now.
Thank you. And I feel God is here now in one way too. Yeah, I feel that energy. So we're going to finish part 1. I'm going to show your book again. And it's a funny thing with this book. It's called Subtraction, the Simple Math of Enlightenment. As I said at the beginning, there's a lot of kind of, half of it is Shawn's struggle. But it's amazing also the realisations he has during that struggle. And I noticed, I don't know why I didn't notice before, I noticed just as he sat down to do the interview, some things written along the edge here. I never saw these before. And things like self plus achievements plus fame equals, is it 0, that symbol?
Not.
It is not.
Or no.
Effort minus self equals wisdom. There's some great things just written around here. So this book is kind of multifaceted in one way. So there's that, and then he's written the other books that I talked about earlier, the Adventures in Cavings, an e-book, the one about celibacy, and then the book with Bob Ferguson doing the photographs, and you doing the poems. And there's 2 DVDs of interviews, Meetings with Remarkable Women, and Closer Than Close. There they are. Thank you again, Shawn.
Thank you very much.
And I hope we see you on part 2. If not, thank you for watching Conscious TV. So, well, welcome back to Conscious TV interview with Shawn Nevins. We had part 1, which was really Shawn's story and the realizations that came out of that, and where the space he got to, a very beautiful space in the end. And this is going to be more practical. He has a section at the back of his book called Spiritual First Aid, which is 12 suggestions about practical things you can do on the spiritual path to keep everything as focused as you can. But I wonder, first of all, Shawn, just talk about how you started to function in the world. You had this realization, you knew who you really were. It was palpable, undoubtable. You knew who you were because you undoubtedly knew who you weren't. How did you then go back in the world and function?
Yeah, well, I distinctly recall I went to work the next day, and it was, I remember thinking something to the effect of, I'm a perfect robot. That was the feeling, that this mechanism, it knew exactly what it needed to do, how to get dressed, how to walk down the steps, get in the car, go to the first appointment. And I just remember marveling at that and how well it functioned. The one thing different that I noticed, though, that my motivation had changed. Like, I didn't care anymore about, I was doing sales at that time, and I didn't care anymore about whether I actually made the sale or not. I would just tell a person, here's what we have, here's what it will do for you. If you want it, great. If not, that's fine. So that was a very practical sort of difference that I noted right away. But I actually, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, something like that later, I came to the feeling that I needed to go to some place and sort of, I needed to find a stable environment or a more familiar environment to be in. And I don't know if that was part of some sort of stabilization process or something like that, but I wound up moving back to the outdoor center where I had worked with kids before, and going back to that environment and staying there about a year. And I really had the luxury of sort of reflecting upon what had happened. And I did a lot of writing, I did a lot of reading of books that I'd read before and seeing them in a new light. It was very helpful for me to be able to go back and be in that space.
Yeah. So it was a kind of, you were kind of re-emerging into the world in one way, and you were doing similar things that you were doing before, but I guess you felt did you feel different, or did you just slide back into it?
I felt very different,
Yes.
which is kind of funny. And again, just sort of on a day-to-day level of some things I remember that when I got back to the outdoor center, I had all these ideas of things I wanted to change and new programs I wanted to do that I would have never considered before. I wanted to go out and try to recruit different businesses to come and do corporate training programs with us, and I had this idea of getting donations from different companies of outdoor gear. I had just all these different thoughts that would never have come to me, I don't think, because I was very boxed in about what I can do, what I can't do. It's just like it was like creativity, or I was much more creative or inspired in terms of possibilities for what could happen. And that's something that's really continued to this day. Like the films, the writing, I tried playing keyboard, piano for a while, just all sorts of things just would catch my eye that I would play around with. And that was very new for me.
So I wanted to, during this program, to cover a little bit the section at the back of your book, your Subtraction, the simple math of enlightenment. You have a section called Spiritual First Aid, and at the beginning of that you write, the main obstacle to success is that people don't start. The second is that they don't persist. The third is they don't adapt. And that's what you did in your journey. You started, you persisted, and then you adapted. And there's you make these 12 recommendations to, if people want some suggestions, and it's all to help, I'm reading again from your book, a peeling away of all we are not in order to discover what we are. So this is not, you say, it's not a step-to-step guide to enlightenment, but what I will offer you are basic principles to apply and adapt as needed. And the first one is to practice honesty, which I know Richard Rose taught you, didn't he?
Yeah, that's, at times when I was putting together that list, I thought I could just stop there. Just practice honesty.
Yes.
And that would really, if a person really applied that, all the rest of it could flow from that. But maybe it would be helpful to put in a few more suggestions, so I did. But that's, Rose used to talk about, like, you're trying to create of yourself a mechanism that seeks truth. And that begins with self-honesty. And we talked about those different levels of backing away from untruth, and it begins at a very practical level of knowing when I'm telling a lie and being honest with myself of, I just told Iain a story. It wasn't true. And now Rose would say, now don't take that to mean that if a policeman pulls you over and writes you a speeding ticket that you just immediately admit that, yes, officer, I was speeding. But there's an attitude there of knowing why you're doing what you're doing and being honest with yourself about, I just lied to the policeman because I was trying to get out of paying for a parking ticket or a speeding ticket. As opposed to the huge stories that we concoct for why, well, it's not fair that police officers give speeding tickets. They should just let people do, in Europe they can drive faster than, and just on and on and on we tell these stories. Just be straight about why you're doing what you're doing.
So it's an awareness of what you're thinking and what you're saying, really. And you're saying to yourself, I think Byron Katie does this actually in her exercises, is that really true?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then the second one, as you say at the end of the first one, as you practice honesty, it will make it easier to remember your natural Koan. So explain what the natural Koan is.
Sure. That is, for each person, there's some desire or longing in the person. And they may say, if they're in an environment of spiritual seekers, they may say, I want enlightenment, or I want awakening. But I think there are really very few people who, what really they're hungering for. They may be hungering for wanting to know something like, what really is thought? Or I've had people say, where am I? Is a meaningful question for them. There are all sorts of things. Why am I unhappy? Something as simple as that can be a natural Koan. It's a thing that I really want to know. Because if you can identify that, then you'll have power, you'll have energy to get an answer. Something very heady and conceptual of, I want to be enlightened, can be very difficult to put any real desire and longing behind that. So be clear about what your true desire is.
Yeah, and so it's knowing about something about yourself at a greater depth somehow.
Yeah, really, just really looking at, I'm going back to feeling, like what question carries feeling when you ask it? Like, what question really has power for you that you react, like your whole mechanism kind of perks up? Yeah, I want to know about that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to find out about that.
Yeah, and you also say in the description of that, if your natural Koan is not obvious, sit alone and write down the questions that concern you. So it's not always easy for people to find something like a Koan, but it's what's bothering them in their life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what they're not clear with.
And it will change. It's not like you have one Koan and that's the thing that will propel you. It will change over time as you change. That question will change and evolve.
And then you say, now that you remember your natural Koan, the next one is focus your energy, which you certainly did. But talk a little bit more about the importance of that.
This is an extremely practical matter of if you are trying to start a business, for example. If you're trying to start 5 businesses at the same time, you're not going to be as effective if you focus your energy on that one business. And in that sense, the spiritual path is not some sort of, it's not immune to the laws of the world or the laws of the mechanism. If you focus your energy, you remove distractions from your focus, from your concentration, you'll have more power in a single direction. Richard Rose used to talk about, imagine in a house, if you turn all the taps on, all the water taps, all the spigots on at the same time, and all the water is flowing out. Imagine that versus just having one spigot open, and all of the force of the water is concentrated in that one tap. It's that idea, like your life is filled with taps or spigots.
Yes, in this modern world, it's easier and easier to find a new tap, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
I know that for myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and then we move on to number 4. And you say, now that you are focusing your energy, realize that you must fall and rise 1,000 times if need be. And you did exactly that.
I did a lot of falling, yes.
But you rose again.
It's very good at falling on my face.
Yeah.
And that came from experience with people I was on the path with, in groups with, and watching other people who would put a lot of energy behind, let's say they're going to go and do a 30-day isolation, and they're thinking like, this is it, this is going to do it, this is going to push me through to enlightenment. And it didn't.
Yes.
And they would give up.
Yeah.
And they would just leave. They would leave the farm or leave a group, and you wouldn't see them again. And it might be years before they got back on the path, or they got re-inspired. And I don't know, except that you just keep, you get up and you try again, or you try from a different angle or a different direction. You just keep pushing, and something will happen.
Yes. And when you wipe the dust off your pants, which you did 1,000 times, remember to identify and, if necessary, repair patterns.
I think this is probably in a way, the most difficult of these steps to write about or explain quickly, because the basic idea is that, we're machines filled with patterns, filled with different eyes, like Ouspensky said. Which of those are real obstacles to our path, to understanding ourselves, and which are just minor distractions? Sometimes people get involved in a perfection. They want to create a perfect mechanism, a perfect seeker. They feel like, I need to be very peaceful, or I need to not have any desires. Or they have all these images of what a spiritual person should be, and they spend a lot of time crafting themselves into that. And there's no end to the imperfections. And there's no end to our idiosyncrasies. And they don't have to be all fixed, repaired. There's a few things, like myself, really shy, really introverted. Well, you know what? It's gonna prevent me from reaching out for help. It's gonna prevent me from seeking out a teacher. It's gonna prevent me from making friends on the path. I should work on that a little bit so that I can have a conversation. I can learn from other people. I'm not so afraid. I don't have to be an extra. I don't have to turn into an extrovert.
Yes.
You just got to be functioning well enough that I can help other people. I can be helped by other people. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Okay. And there's lots people can read in if you get the book about the details of that, what Shawn suggests. And the next one, as you work on identifying patterns, be sure to develop intuition, which Richard Rose really encouraged you to do, which we talk about in part 1 of the interview.
Right, and in the book I lay out some different practices that might be helpful for a person to try, things like celibacy, things like I might even mention hanging around with people who are intuitive, people who are very different from you. Rose even encouraged us to do things like experiment with reading cards, ESP cards, and reading other people's thoughts, practicing hypnosis. He had all sorts of recommendations for intuition. Myself being in nature was really important for me in developing a feeling. Like when I was 22, literally, if you asked me what I felt, I would have to pause and really think about it. Like, what do I feel?
Yes.
I mean, at a very crude, rough level, I wasn't in touch with even that level of feeling, much less a subtler level of, an intuition of the profound.
Yeah, you also talk about here observation is really helpful. What's your decision-making process? And you mentioned prayer. This can be a statement of your intention to improve your intuition. So you've got lots of practical things you, there's a whole list here, yeah. That you say dream work, fasting. Okay, and as you follow that feeling, be thankful. It's number 7, to be thankful.
And that was another one that was tough for me. Really being thankful. I think Rose clued me into this when I was describing an experience that happened to me, and he said, well, you know, don't go chasing after that. I think I'd had something like a feeling of being at one in nature, or like there was more to me than just my little self. I'd gotten a glimpse of that, and he said, well, he said, don't chase after that, but just be thankful that that happened. And that really left an impression upon me that, you know, being thankful, that it's not like it takes away some of that thought of, well, I did this, I caused this to happen. When I just say that whatever is out there, it's like, thank you. You know, not thank you God or thank you Absolute, but just thank you.
And then, as you give thanks, look for the source.
Yeah, that's that was really. We did a retreat last weekend, and I was really driving home, you know, how you look for the source, what that meditation is like, and really pointing people in an inward direction of what are you? Where do you come from? Where does thought come from? Where does the feeling of being an individual come from? That sort of interior observation, and that's what I'm getting at, is looking for that source.
Yes. Yeah, you mentioned here again, which we talked about in part 1, the view is not the viewer. Whatever you believe yourself to be, look to find where it originates. There's clues there all the time, isn't there? And it's just a question of, if you want to spend the time looking at the clues and seeing what you can find underneath.
Yeah, there's a thread to follow there that takes one back to the source, the place from which we emanate.
Okay, and I see you actually give a whole quote here from Franklin Merrell-Wolff's The Induction, which again we talked about in part 1. Okay, and then as an aid to your path, find a teacher.
Yeah.
And you had a few. One main one, but you had
did.
A few. Yeah.
Certainly Richard Rose was a key figure, but and I mentioned this in that section, that it wasn't just teachers, it wasn't Douglas Harding or Bernadette Roberts, it was friends. I got a tremendous amount just from having friends on the path and being open to little things that they would say, or little suggestions. This whole thing of working with children that I mentioned before, that was a key practice for me, and that suggestion came from a friend. Richard Rose actually very rarely suggested much of anything, but there were key little suggestions and inspirations that came from friends.
Okay. Do not rely on just one teacher, for you must help and be helped. Help and be helped. Yeah, a balance.
Yeah, that was sort of my take on. Rose had a little law that he called the law of the ladder, which is that wherever you are on the path, there's someone who is below you on this imaginary ladder, who's in a place where you've been before, and there's someone above you, and that this ladder is a progression upward towards an awakening, and you can be helped by people above you, and you can help the people below you, and we're all lifting each other up. And so, yeah, this idea of that one was rather mechanical for me for a long time. That, Rose said I should help other people because I will be helped by helping other people. Therefore, I'm going to help other people. It was a very selfish motivation in my helping other people for a long time, until it really wasn't until I moved to Texas and started working on the Spiritual Teachers website that I actually had an interior uprising or compassion that I just wanted to share some things that I had found that were of value to me. And if someone found them useful, great, and if not, fine. But I wanted to put that out there. And oftentimes I think of that as one of the first unselfish things that I did.
And you start this section, Help and Be Helped, by a quote from Jim Rohn. You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Well, I haven't thought of that before. The average. So, well, it's worth thinking about.
That was a big part of my path, was choosing wisely my associates.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, and the end of that section you say, another bit of seeming selfishness that pays dividends is to spend time alone, which you did an awful lot of.
I did, and it's a continuation of this idea of focusing one's energy. So spending time alone is going to eliminate the distractions of conversation and the dynamics that are going on in a group, which we're always at some level navigating, consciously or unconsciously. It's just me and silence and maybe a book or a journal and a question or an intent. I found that very important. If I'm going to spend that time alone, I need to have an intent for it. Otherwise, the mind will go in all sorts of directions.
And the only distraction is yourself.
And believe me, I had plenty of distractions for myself. Yeah.
And then the last one, yes, you write quite a lot about spending time alone, because you did enough of it, so you know a lot about it. And you finish that section saying, lastly, you will discover the need to learn to tread water.
Yeah, that's related in a way to rising and falling 1,000 times if need be, but it's a little different, because I had a lot of depression and feeling like I wasn't making any progress, and it was difficult working or being around Richard Rose, because his path, he as a person was very intense and dynamic, and he was the kind of guy who, if there were a glass wall between him and the truth, he would break the glass wall down with his head. Just that kind of intensity. And I felt over and over like, that's not me. I don't have his passion. They talk about in Zen your hair being on fire.
Yes.
Like, that's the kind of intensity that you need. And I never felt that way.
Yeah.
I always felt lacking. And that sort of holding myself up to an idea of how I should be would many times, comparison would lead to depression. I'm not strong enough. I'm not energetic enough. I can't. This is too much. I can't do this. And in those time periods, I had a little phrase that was, never make a decision in a mood. And it was useful for me, and it's related to treading water. Like, all right, I don't see a way out of this. I don't know what to do, but if nothing else, I'm just going to hold my position. Okay, I'm going to meditate each day, even though it feels dry, it feels pointless. I'm just going to keep doing it. I'm not going to leave the farm, or I'm not going to just quit meditating. I'm not going to take some dramatic action of, I just quit this. I'm headed back home. Just going to hold my ground, tread water, until something comes along, some inspiration, some new current comes along, because I know it will. It feels like it won't, but I know something will come along.
So you have to be patient, and you have to trust.
Yeah.
And you have to stay with whatever's happening to you, which isn't always easy, as you found out. And you say in that section, never make a decision in a mood.
Right.
Which you just talked about. So
right.
important. That's right. Yeah. In fact, there's a lot on this as well. And I like the way you finish off this section. You say, some of these principles may not resonate with you, and that's okay. If I was stuck on a mental desert island and could only take one aid with me, I'd choose practiced honesty. That is the North Star that guides you to discover, adapt, and amplify all the other principles. Practice honesty. It's great. It's a great finish. Yeah.
Yeah, and I hope people take the end of the book as suggestive rather than prescriptive.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, thank you. I'm going to show you a book again. Subtraction, the simple math of enlightenment. I'm going to thank you again, Shawn, for coming along to
You're
Conscious
welcome.
TV.
Thank you for having me.
I've enjoyed it very much. And, well, maybe we meet again. Who knows?
Maybe so. The time flew by.
Time flew by, yeah. Okay.